Good morning. I'm Commissioner Michael Owen, Vice Chair of the HART Board of Directors. Please silence all electronic devices for the duration of the meeting. Welcome to the July 17th, 2023 Board of Directors Workshop on Legal and Governance Structure, which is now called to order. The meeting format is hybrid with board members physically present at the HART Administrative Office, 1201 East 7th Avenue, Florida Conference Room, and participating by communication media technology. We will honor the stars and stripes one more time. Please join me for the pledge. All right, thank you, everybody. Staff, please take attendance.
Chair Vieira indicated he would be absent. Vice Chair Owen?
Here.
Director Williams? Here. Director Henderson?
Present.
Director Frazier?
Here.
Director Johnson?
Here.
Director Kemp?
Here.
Director Knight?
Here.
Director Mechanic? Here. Director Myers?
Here.
Director Schisler?
Here.
And Director Wolstel indicated he would be absent. You do have quorum, even though it's not necessary.
Thank you. Next is public input. I don't think there was anyone pre-registered, correct? Is there anyone here that would like to speak? Okay, seeing nothing further, we will move on. To our first presentation, Mr. David Adams will present the findings regarding systematic issues. Good morning, Mr. Adams.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, board members, Mr. Greenville. My name is David Adams. I'm outside employment counsel. I was asked to talk about thank you. I was asked to talk about two things today: systemic issues, employment issues, and secondly, how the legal department's structured, and make some recommendations regarding that. So let me jump right into it. I don't need to tell this board there's been an abnormal amount of turnover in the CEO position over the last few years. And so this presentation is designed to outline some of the observations that I made as I was doing some of my investigation, and some things for the board and senior management's consideration. As of March 2023, almost all of the board information came by and through the CEO. And essentially no other employees were allowed to interact with board members unless cleared by the CEO. And frankly, if anybody tried to do that, they were disciplined or and sometimes terminated. So, one of the main points I'd like to make today is there just needs to be some alternative systems to provide information to the board. And this is a delicate balance. You guys are sophisticated, so you know that, in general, the board generates the vision for the organization, and then they hire a CEO who goes out and implements that vision. And in general, board members shouldn't tinker with the day-to-day operations, but at the same time, they can't be completely without knowledge as to what's going on, so that they can, serve in their oversight capacity. So I'm trying to create, a balance that allows for appropriate oversight, but at the same time, not what I call tinkering or interfering with Mr. Drainfield's ability to run the organization. So the first piece that's left over from my investigation is that the CEO has to be open and candid with the board chair on all events, whether they be good, bad, or indifferent. And that was a struggle that we had with the last CEO. And a second thing is that the board should demand an annual strategic plan, which I'm sure is in process now, that's aligned both with the budget, which is a challenge for our organization, as well as key performance indicators. Senior management and the board council should try and work collaboratively to ensure that the board is informed on all issues. So that's one of the nice things about having board council. Your board council can keep you up to date on, critical issues. And HART works in a highly regulated industry, and you have very good board counsel. They're extremely experienced in a lot of government activities and have served in a number of different capacities. So they're a tremendous resource. Use them to your advantage. For example, HART has an employee feedback system called Ethics Point. And Ethics Point allows employees to report anonymous issues to HART. And the idea is that it's designed to be an alternative reporting structure. So for example, if your supervisor is the basis of your problem, it's kind of hard to go to your supervisor and complain about conduct that the supervisor is engaged in. So Ethics Point is there as a method of going around the chain of command when it's not working properly, so that management can follow up on those things. And prior to March of 2023, a lot of the Ethics Point complaints that I looked at were either not followed up promptly or sometimes not even acknowledged. And the problem is people talk. And when they hear that nobody's paying attention to their concerns, it denigrates that system. So one of the recommendations I thought would make sense and to give the board an alternative means of getting information is to have the board council monitor ethics point. When an ethics point complaint comes in, it gets assigned to people, usually to in-house counsel and to the CEO and to whoever else it relates to. And so this might be a good way to, have some alternative method of keeping an eye on things so emerging issues can be decided. The second part of it is the HR function just really needs help and staffing. And I think Mr. Drainville's already working on this, so some of this may be old. Keep in mind, I put these comments together back in March of 2023, and here it is July. But as a result of the November 9th layoffs, the HR function was pretty much gutted, and 33% of the positions as of March were vacant. Look, HART has 800 employees, and at the time, it had no director of HR, and there wasn't any plan to bring in a director of HR. Now, I think that's changed because I looked on the internet and I saw that one was advertised, posted yesterday. So again, my thunder's been stolen a little bit here, but that's at odds with every other transit agency, and you need a director of HR. The manager that you do have of HR is actually doing a good job, and I've worked with him, and he's capable and competent, but he needs help. The core HR functions that I thought were lacking that we need to focus on is a little bit more towards the structure again. Obviously, the CEO establishes the managerial positions in their departments. However, any changes in that organization chart should normally be ratified by the board. And I think Commissioner Kemp has tried to encourage everybody to have the organization charts available on the website so that the public can see them and so that you guys can see them. There was a time when those were, not available either on the website or even sometimes to the board. I think you need to have standards for fair compensation, and I'm not talking about DEI, but there were instances under the old administration where people were brought in for new positions and were paid wildly more than people who had been here for 5, 10, maybe even 15 years. And so look, pay is important. People, the thing I've learned about my work here is the people who work in transit are very dedicated. They love transit. They love helping people. They love helping people get along. We owe them the duty to make sure that they're paid fairly and consistent with their abilities. Along similar lines, we had trouble with promotions and disciplinary things. Fair promotion, disciplinary processes are really important, and they need to be put in place and followed. And an employee manual, which you guys have a good one. These are things that should be drafted by senior management, but are things that should be, ratified by the board and reviewed by the board. The recruiting process needs help. Existing prospective employees struggle with the recruiting process. It's cumbersome, it's difficult. Sometimes people are locked out of it due to technological issues. And HART needs a stronger onboarding process. When we bring people in, we need to make sure they understand what the rules are, understand what their expectations are. These two things go hand in hand with the onboarding, but documentation was poor when I looked at the personnel files. A lot of times the job descriptions weren't in there. If they were in there, they weren't signed, and they're just missing key information. And so, we should have a system where you have an annual employment training so that everybody knows what the rules are, everybody knows what the expectations are, and, basically just to invest in your HR. That's probably, I don't have the budget numbers in front of me, but I bet it's 60 to 70% of your budget is HR. You're in the people business. The people business are what makes this organization successful and makes our riders successful. HART does an excellent job on focusing on rider service levels and on-time performance. I've seen several presentations in board meetings where that's a focus, and it should be. But at the same time, we want to have a similar focus on our employees and the people who develop those systems in place. For example, Lynx, which is a sister agency over in Orlando, has a director of organizational development and training. And they develop, succession plans and try and identify people who are highly qualified and deserve to be promoted and whatnot. And just provides a system for making sure that your best employees get, put in positions where they can lead the organization best. The CEO evaluation process. I think this happens, but I just want to underscore it. The CEO needs to be evaluated once a year, preferably at the beginning of the fiscal year. And board council should administer and evaluate that process. One recommendation that, again, provides additional information to this board is to have 360-degree feedback. And that's not only feedback from the board down to the CEO as to how he or she is doing, but also maybe get some feedback from the chiefs and the directors so that you have a full circle of people who can help evaluate the CEO. And that's common in larger organizations. Evaluation, should be coordinated with the key performance indicators and the strategic plan and the budget. The idea is you start the, evaluation process, set the goals, evaluate those as the year goes on, make sure they line up, and then evaluate the CEO at the end so that it's a continuous circle of continuous improvement. Another issue that came up during the investigation was operating in the sunshine. So as you know, HART is required to operate in the sunshine under Florida law. Under former leadership, bad news was frequently not included in the public records as it should be. For example, there were absolutely no text messages available for any of the HART company phones. And that made my job a lot harder because I think a lot of the things that came out in the investigation probably were included in text messages, which I wasn't able to access. But in any event, I think it's a good idea to have training and creating training on public records and including those and preserving them. Look, as I wrap this part of it up, this is a complex topic. It's hard to get up here for 10 minutes and go through all the things that, are critical from an oversight standpoint for the board. I think it makes sense to have either a consultant or some other subject matter expert to kind of come in, interview me, maybe interview a group of the executive committee here, and identify the things that we think are important, and then to try and put something in place so that we could, implement those recommendations, preferably by either fiscal year end or by calendar year end. So that wraps up the systemic issues. Does anybody have any questions about that piece? I think it's pretty cut and dry.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. Commissioner Kemp?
I just want to say thank you. I think it's an excellent outline of kind of positive steps we can take, and just identifying general ways that we can get at some of the issues we've had, because it has been just, if we have a CEO that comes in, they almost work with impunity in terms of, or review, as it turns out now. And we really need to, I think, work on every single one of those suggestions. I think is a good one.
Yeah, and it is important, you guys know this, but you can't have the CEO be the scapegoat if you have, other problems within the organization. And when the CEO position turns over a lot, you're going to have a hard time attracting qualified candidates because they're going to look at the history and see that they don't make it very long, be it their fault or otherwise. I don't have any reservations about what we've done in the last 6 months, don't get me wrong, but it is important to let a person get in place, get their feet on the ground, and make the improvements that they need to make the organization both effective and efficient. All right, so, I'm sorry, yes.
David, you said we had a very good employee manual, but I didn't hear a comment beyond that. Is it that we're not following the manual, or is that part of the component working well here?
Yeah, the manual's there and it provides the rules, and most people follow the rules. It's the 80-20 situation. 80% of the people follow the rules and do what they're supposed to. But there is a vocal minority, and there's been a history of having a vocal minority that sometimes raises whistleblowing or other types of technical violations with your CEO, and that creates an investigation that results in turnover of the CEO. I think you do have, relatively good policies and practices. I think the implementation of those policies and practices are what's lacking. And keep in mind, you haven't had a director of HR since November. So we're coming up on 6 or 8 months, and that function just needs to be massaged. If you get a qualified person in and they'll know what to do. It's a little bit like pornography. It's hard to describe, but you know it when you see it. Bring in a good HR person, they'll clean up the situation, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Ms. Williams, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Adams, for the overview. My question centers around the fact that you said no other employees were allowed to interact with board members unless cleared by the CEO. And then a little bit more about that process, because I heard you mention ethics point, but is that the only form of interaction employees will work to other than their hierarchical structure?
There's no procedure for this, but I will tell you that historically, what I had observed was there was a close interaction between the board and the board attorney. And so the board attorney was frequently kept up to date on, issues that were going on in the organization prior to the last CEO. And like I said, there's no process or procedure that required that, but I think it was just the people who were all trusted each other, and they had open and candid discussions, and that allowed for, the board to be kept apprised of what I call emerging issues or things that need attention. And part of that, to be honest, I believe was Ms. Pettit, was good at communication and keeping everybody up to speed. And there was a time when she wasn't here, and thankfully she's back, and I think she helps that process. But I don't know if you need to put something formal in place, but, your board attorney is a nice way of bridging the gap between senior management and your oversight as a board. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, but I still think it recommends, or just make a note for the records, is that that's a key aspect of a business being healthy and successful, and to hear their employees and the comments from the employees. So I just would recommend we have a clear delineation of where they can go and have comments or just even feedback, positive, not only negative.
Correct.
But a process that is clear to them, that their voices will be heard.
Yeah, and again, that your link to that, is really through the HR function. We have exit interviews, which we gather information from when people moved for other opportunities or otherwise, and so you can gather some information by that. But that's going to come through your HR process, in my opinion, and work through the CEO and then get distributed to the board. It might make sense to have a periodic presentation from your director of HR once the person gets here and gets their feet, in the ground, and talk about a lot of the things that I'm talking about in this presentation, and about which ones they agree with or which ones they don't agree with, and which way you should move forward. So I think maybe if you could put a calendar item for 6 months later, maybe, to come back and revisit that and ask for, recommendations as to the things that the new director of HR has found and things that they plan to do, and then that'll give you a sense of that. And those are good questions to ask the director of HR, is what is an appropriate process for making sure we get some feedback from the board, to the board, from employees, but at the same time, we don't want the board, meddling, for lack of a better term, in the day-to-day operations. That's the CEO's job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Mr.
Any
Evans.
more?
No, I just have one thing. On the evaluations, could you kind of went kind of quick when you were talking about evaluating the CEO. What was your recommendation on how that process would work? I'm just curious. Because as you get to the top, as Mr. Mechanic knows too, as a law firm, me and my business partner, we would actually, we would do an evaluation for each other. So as you get to the top, it gets tougher. What would be your recommendation on that?
It does. So, obviously you and your senior management know what the key metrics are for the organization: on-time performance, routes, planning, all those types of things. Identify those things, and every year, it's my belief that the CEO and the senior staff should put together a success plan. I think what I call it a strategic plan, but what historically has been called a success plan, and it identifies what the goals of the organization are in light of its resources and the things that it plans to achieve. And so those are items that, and this happens in employment contracts for executive also. Sure. These are the goals we expect the organization to achieve in the coming year, and then go back and revisit those at the end of the year and look at have they been achieved, have they not been achieved, and if not, why not? And then, it's a circle of what I call continuous improvement, and you can mold those things so that, your senior management's doing the things that you guys believe is important from an oversight standpoint.
Yeah, because your employee handbook and your employment agreement really work in conjunction as one contract, is how I always look at it, because, and I think it's very important that everyone who's employed signs both of those. So I hope that, we practice that moving forward, where the employee handbook is executed along with the employment agreement, of course.
Yeah, and there's been, in the times I've been at this for about 5 years now, and at one point, we actually did, employment training, and we brought everybody in, and we recorded some of the programs, we did some of them live, and had, Q&A and make sure everybody understood what the rules were and what they needed to do. But half of it's development. You want to develop your employees so they get better at what they do, other than sitting in the chair. And the other half is making sure everybody understands what the rules are and they follow it from a compliance standpoint.
Yeah.
And I think, once you get a director of HR in place, hopefully that person knows those systems and starts to put them in place, including the evaluation of the CEO. They should work with board counsel who should implement that function because they're closest to the board, and the board determines the goals, and hopefully they get achieved.
Yeah, great. Anybody else? Okay, great. Great presentation, Mr. Adams. Appreciate it.
I have one more thing to talk about the
Sure.
legal structure, which
Yes.
is, again, not particularly heavy. So they asked me also to look at the legal structure and to make some recommendations on that. And so there's usually three common structures for a legal department in a company. The first one's like the full in-house general counsel, who's often also an executive vice president and/or corporate secretary. The second is the exact opposite, no in-house legal department, everything's referred out to outside counsel. And the third is the one that HART uses, which is a hybrid model where you have an in-house legal department that handles the day-to-day matter, and then use outside counsel for board counsel and for specialty areas. So let's dig into each of those three things. The first one is the full in-house general counsel. This is common in like a large publicly traded company. You have a general counsel who's normally extremely experienced, 20 to 30 years of experience in that particular industry. He or she creates and supervises an in-house legal department and it does the function. And the key there is the general counsel just provides advice on all legal matters from day-to-day, signing of contracts, which is somewhat mundane, all the way up to the high-profile issues such as, a $500 million bond issue. And then, of course, they hire specialty counsel in specialty areas. And an example of this is the Hillsborough Aviation Authority. So the Hillsborough Aviation Authority has a general counsel who is also an executive vice president. In addition to that, that person actually supervises functional areas within the authority, human resources, information technology, governmental affairs, and things like that. So the full in-house, general counsel is a critical part of the senior management team. They have responsibilities other than just being a lawyer. The second one is the opposite. Everything's sent to outside counsel. There is no internal legal department. Everything gets outsourced essentially, and normally the work's done by a single firm. So the downside of that is it's very expensive. I talked to Carrie Sarver, who is the Director of Legal Affairs over at Lynx in Orlando, and she said that was the system that they had until she came in a couple of years ago, and they were spending almost $1 million a year in legal services. The upside of it is it's more independent. People report directly to the board in that instance, and you have a fairly high service level. So examples of that is Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority. Alan Zimmett at Bryant, Miller, and Olive is the outside legal guy, and to the best of my understanding, he does everything. So that's an example of that. And then the third one is what HART uses. You have a director of legal services and in-house lawyers that handle the day-to-day issues at a price-conscious manner. Outside counsels retained to advise the board, which is what you have with board counsel. Outside counsels retained for specialty areas, labor and employment, and some of those areas. The director of legal services supervises the outside counsel, holds them accountable to budgets and whatnot. And the advantage of this is it's very cost effective. Your in-house people, do a great job and they can handle the day-to-day stuff. And that's the model that HART currently uses. So this is the org chart for the legal department. It's a little hard to read, so I'll just kind of walk you through it. As of December 13th, 2022, at the top of it is the Director of Legal Services, Brenda. As you can see, it comes down to a deputy attorney, which that position's now filled, but it wasn't as of this official chart. And then there's a couple, and then she has, some attorneys that she supervises, as well as some paralegals and some admin assistants. But there's a couple of places that are unusual in this org chart. And on the far left-hand side, you have Jason Wright, the manager of risk, and he's in the legal department. And sometimes that makes sense because risk, does have legal support. Obviously, people get injured by our buses and get injured in the buses and what time. And so it's not unusual to have risk within the legal department, but a lot of times it's under a different functional umbrella. And the other place that's odd is over on the far right-hand side, you have Kelly White, the manager of labor relations, who's also a very good employee, but it's odd to have her in the legal department. There's a little bit of a reason for that because, part of labor relations is arbitrations, and those are adversarial proceedings that involve legal type items. But for the most part, the manager of labor relations, negotiates your collective bargaining agreement and with your unions and whatnot. So I think she actually might have already been moved over to the HR department. So I won't spend much more time on that. I thought it might help to look at what some of your other people are. This chart's very small, it's hard to see. But this is the Links organizational chart at the bottom there. It was dated July 3rd, 2023, so it's very recent. And you'll see that the risk management function is under the CFO. And that makes sense because not only does the risk manager manage risk from a litigation standpoint, but also does the insurance relationships and takes care of self-insured reserves and balances the cost and effectiveness of self-insuring and hiring outside insurance. Similarly, with Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority, the risk manager is also under the CFO function. In that instance, some people put it under, some agencies have a chief administrative officer, and sometimes the risk function is under the chief administrative officer. And Mr. Drainville said that he's considering that for HART. But it's probably better to have it outside of the legal department, to be honest. I also note on all of these org charts, you'll notice that that person's a director of risk management. And they have the ability to save, the agency a tremendous amount of money, both with the insurance relationships and with the things. You have a manager of risk. So depending on whether, where you put that and how that works, you should think about, if that's an appropriate classification. The next area that we need to study is compliance. And compliance is always a tricky part of legal. And, who's in charge of compliance and making sure the agency's in compliance with all the state and federal regulations. There's 4 key compliance areas that I think are important to look at for HART. The EEO officer, which is required by federal statutes, the DBE, Disadvantaged Business Enterprises Coordinator, which is also required by federal law, Title VI, which is a civil rights statute similar to Title VII, and the ADA, Americans with Disability Act. So the EEO officer and the DBE under federal law require a dotted line authority directly to the CEO, similar to safety. So so let's take a look how other people have used those. So here's your sister agency in Pinellas. DBE is part of procurement, and it's under the Director of Procurement, DBE Liaison Officer. And you'll see down in the bottom right-hand corner, it says DBE Coordinator, and then you'll see the dotted line that goes all the way up to the CEO, which is the appropriate reporting structure. So I think it makes sense. DBE is frankly a procurement function, and so you're trying to get business to disadvantaged business enterprises, and so that does make sense, in my opinion, to keep that in the procurement area and probably not in the legal area. The EEO officer and the Title VI, which is a civil rights statutes, are also part of HR, and so if you look at Pinellas, they've got that under the Director of Human Resources, EEO officer, and I think that makes sense. One of the things you don't want to do is have your legal department investigating everything, because if your legal department investigates everything, then they can't be a lawyer and they can't be an advocate, because they're a witness essentially. And so it's good to keep those investigatory functions outside of the legal department so your legal department can do what they're supposed to be, which is to be an advocate if there's a claim and to evaluate the risk. This is Link's organization chart, and you'll see that they decided to keep the Civil Rights Compliance Administrator and under the legal department. So reasonable minds can differ on this. That system seems to work for them, and so they've got that underneath their in-house legal counsel at Links in Orlando. The ADA compliance in PTSA is under the Chief Operating Officer, Chief Safety Officer. I think that makes sense. ADA primarily for your business is accessibility to the buses and accessibility to the stops. So I think that makes sense to keep it under the safety umbrella, similar to what PSTA has done. So to kind of wrap it up, these are my recommendations for reassignments of the legal department. I think the manager of risk or director of risk should be focused either under an administrative umbrella, if there is one, or under the chief financial officer. The manager of labor relations belongs in human resources, which I understand has already been done. The EEO officer should be the director of human resources. The DBE coordinator should be part of procurement. Title VI should be part of the director of human resources. And lastly, the ADA officer should be under the safety department. So I just wanted to do a small tweak to the board counsel. If you read the policies and procedures, your general counsel is general counsel to the board. And so when I think of general counsel, going back to the three different models, I think the general counsel is the guy or gal who's in charge of all legal compliance. And that's clearly not what your board counsel does. They're not in charge of all legal compliance. They're only, in charge of things they've either been consulted on or board matters. So I'd like to tweak that a little bit and change the name to board counsel, because I think it more accurately reflects what your general board counsel is doing today. That's that. Lastly, I just want to go through the professional responsibility piece, because that's important for all the lawyers who work for HART. So all HART lawyers, whether they're in-house or outside lawyers like myself, have to comply with Florida Rule of Professional Responsibility 4-1.13. And that essentially defines who's the client when you're a lawyer for the organization. So the lawyer's duty is to the organization under Rule 1.13, and HART is obviously the client and obviously the organization. So a lawyer hired by the organization represents the organization through people, such as this board, and through senior management. So it's important for all lawyers to understand, myself included, that there's a conflict between the goals of the officers and what's best for the organization. The lawyer has to raise that to the highest authority, which in this case is this board of directors. That's unlikely, but it's just important that everybody understands, who the allegiance is to. It's to this organization, no matter if they get their day-to-day oversight. So with that in mind, let me just talk about the three tweaks that I think make sense to your legal organization. In the upper left-hand corner, I'd like the general counsel to be renamed the board counsel, which, as you can see, has a dotted line to the director of legal services because she administers that function. On the bottom left-hand corner, I think the risk management needs to move either out to the CEO or to an administrative officer if that's what senior management decides is appropriate. And then lastly, move labor relations under human resources. So when that's all said and done, essentially this is what your org chart looks like. At the top is, of course, this group, the board of directors. Off to the right is the board counsel, which provides advice to the board of directors. Underneath that is the CEO. The CEO directs the director of legal services, but because of Rule 4-1.13, the director of legal services has kind of a dotted line that goes back up to the board because that's where the allegiance is and should be. And in 99% of the time, you're not going to have any conflicts that raise that dotted line. But in the event there are, it's important that everyone understands it. And then there's a deputy attorney down to the right in the middle who supervises outside counsel. And then the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that you have staff attorneys who deal primarily with risk management, with slip and fall and those types of things. So that's my recommendation on the organization, the legal counsel. I think it's pretty well organized. As you can see, I just have a couple of minor recommendations in that respect. So are there any questions with respect to that?
Great. Any questions? Commissioner Kemp?
This is excellent, and I want to kind of go over it again.
Sure.
Once I'm out of here and look at it. I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, I brought printouts that I can
I
hand out to
figured you
everybody.
did, and think about it, but it's really, again, I was like looking for something like this, especially in terms of our legal counsel. I agree totally about board counsel and that distinction. I'm a little bit wondering, and I haven't gotten to sink this in. I know how you did the dotted line. I'm glad you did the Florida professional responsibility to the organization as opposed to, for instance, the CEO, if the CEO differed.
Right.
And so that's important to point out because we've just had that issue arise. And I'm just wondering, obviously, the board hires board counsel. And I know on this chart, and I haven't thought this through because it's
Sure.
first impression, and I just want to catch you. And so the in-house attorney is under the CEO with this duty somewhat that you said has hardly ever
board.
been exercised. I can imagine that's true. And then you have the board counsel at the other end. But is there any thought that we hire the board counsel, as you've named it? Is there any thought to the attorney, in-house attorney, also being hired by the board? And I'm just, and that is a modified structure of what we have at the county, and that's why it comes to mind as well.
Right, and I think Julia and David actually handed out, some alternative structures, and they talked about the different legal structures at all the different agencies. And that kind of goes back to the model where, you have a general counsel who kind of everything goes through and then, goes up or goes down. You have that one common point. So, yeah, you could do that if you want to. I think currently the board counsel is done through procurement. And so you might want to look at how that's done. That may be something that the board counsel serves at the pleasure of the board, as opposed to, going through a procurement process where cheapest may be best or may not be best. But, you're right.
Oh, that's interesting too, which, that's very interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
from what I understand, and Julia.
That,
you can
you're
weigh in.
totally correct, but
That is accurate. I mean, all of what Mr. Adams is saying, and David Smith is also on the line, so he can, go interrupt me or stop me if I'm going out of the lines here, but I am absolutely in agreement with everything that Mr. Adams has said, and in fact, over my time working as your general counsel, have thought that those were the exact types of changes that need to be made. Now, I had provided different ways different organizations have handled their attorney counsel, and, certainly there's a lot of different ways to skin this cat. That being said, I do think that there's value, as we have to go rewrite some of your policies to implement these things, in having a structure where the quote, director of legal services, getting rid of the nomenclature of a general counsel, is at a very minimum confirmed by the board, so at least it's not just this random person that you've never met or been involved with. I think if you look at all of the structures that I have sent you, all of them have a component which is either it's a board decision or it's a board confirmation. And so because of that rule of professional responsibility, I do think that unlike all of the other portions of your executive management team in an organizational structure, that council position is one that has a dual responsibility, notwithstanding which side they're on. I think that the way we've framed it over the years, although never really acts more like the org chart you're seeing today, has made that an unclear issue depending on who's looking at it. And I think we can tighten that up, make sure that that's clear, and make sure everybody knows who's responsible to who. And so that would be, as we move forward from Mr. Adams' recommendations and implementation, I think some tweaks to your board policies can further provide for that.
because I would like to know that if there is the kind of issues that have occurred here, that we do what we can to make sure that there are some, if it ever evolved into this again, that there is some place that there could be some open communication. And I think having just the CEO there with the key point person, besides maybe the HR person, who would be hired by the CEO and accountable, but to have, especially with that duty written in, which I'm familiar with and have always kind of wondered about here, that somehow there is, a bigger role for the board in that in-house counsel, so that we can make sure that there's some ability by that in-house counsel to be able to feel comfortable communicating important points to the board should it ever need to happen again.
Yeah, and so if you go back to the org chart that I put up here for just a second, you'll see I didn't say this in the presentation, I should have. There's a dotted line between the Director of Legal Services up to the Board Counsel. And that's also in part because of the ethics rules. And so the practical effect is if the Director of Legal Services being unduly, bullied, for lack of a better term, by senior management, I would expect that they would go to the Board Counsel so the Board Counsel could bring it to the attention of the board. And I don't know if that's in our policies, I don't think it is, but that's how I would answer that question.
My other question is there's no requirement, and Julie, you might, both of you might be able to comment on this, but where we have all these procurement rules that come from the state, but I guess there is no requirement that we procure our attorney in that way.
There is no requirement in state statute or in any other statutory provision that you hire your attorney through a specified procurement process. It's typically related to whatever the policies are for a particular organization. The majority do, regardless if it's board counsel or it's general counsel or any kind of outside attorney, do it through either an RFP or RFQ process. And I think, and we had a conversation before the meeting today, and in speaking about this, David Smith, David Adams, and myself, probably moving to an RFQ process would be good for your legal services as well, but that's not what we're really talking about now. But yes, that process is one where you're not obligated to go through that process. And I do want to make it clear, there's no obligation that you have a separate board counsel. You can have it all in-house, you can have it all out-of-house. There's a couple ways this cat could get skinned depending on your organization, but your organization, the way it's set up through state statute, has a strong board. It's, there's different kinds of organizational structures. That's how you're set up, with a strong board and a CEO who is hired for the purposes of taking the policy set by the board and implementing that with responsibility back to the board. So when you start from that context, that's why in this particular structure, having that duality makes some level of sense.
Well, and I would think it's always important to have that. I think it's terribly important, but I'd like to see the Director of Legal Services more have some confirmation or what. It's interesting that other organizations are doing that so that there's some availability, like I said, to avoid some of the issues maybe that we've gotten into and, to see if we can't get us a better structure in terms of that.
If I could just add a few observations.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, okay. Who is that?
You can
I'm
hear
sorry.
me?
Who is
This
that?
is David Smith.
Oh, Mr. Smith, yes, go ahead.
All right, just a few other observations. I was involved with the Hillsborough County Aviation Authority when they had their situation with general counsel and the board members, and dealt with the whole issue of restructuring their organization. We ultimately kept the same organization they had, which was a strong in-house general counsel. But it's important to keep in mind, Hillsborough County Aviation Authority and Fort Tampa Bay are very different from HART. They generate a lot of their own revenue through fees and services. HART is an organization that's funded almost entirely by governmental sources. So the board has a much more significant and public responsibility role to make sure that the whole process is run and consistent with those procurements. And the biggest issue that I think you've had, just to touch on a couple points, I've been around as general counsel for about 6 different CEOs. The critical issue is what the CEO's attitude is. All CEOs, if they're any good, want to run the organization, so they have a tendency to be strong and assertive. That's not a bad thing. The problem is sometimes it also becomes an obsession about control. So not only were members told not to talk to this board in recent regime, they were told not to talk to general counsel. We've not had that before. Well, partially maybe with Ben, we had that as well. Maybe it's an Atlanta thing. But we have generally been your ears on the ground to get information to you, but when we're not in the loop, we can't do that. So you need strong independent input. You need it from your board counsel, if that's the terminology you're going to use, and you really need it from others, and we need to figure out a way, and this is what David Adams was talking about, finding ways to get you a conduit of that information. One other thing I'd also tell you, although I agree with Julia, David, and I have been talking about this thing probably for 6 or 7 months, all evolved around the CEO issue, which is so critical. PSTA, for example, does have all outside counsel, but unlike Lynx, their general counsel or board counsel services were about $250,000, not $1 million. So you can structure that position differently. I like the in-house general counsel because there's so much going on at HART. There's so much need for legal advice on a day-to-day basis, and the board counsel can't possibly provide that. But in-house counsel can, whether it's director of legal services or whatever. But anyway, I think your key is independent independent input from sources that know what's going on. And Julia and I and David also agree. I like basically the RFQ process, where you get qualifications and you vote on it. And the other thing Director Kemp mentioned, I think you should be involved in the approval of the in-house direct legal services counsel, because that's very important. They are ultimately obligated to you, and so you should be involved in that process. So just a few anecdotal additions to the excellent work David did and the summary Julia provided.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Director Williams and Director Schischler, and then Director Johnson.
Thank you. David, you may have answered my questions, but let me just go ahead and talk about it just to make sure we have clarity. So there are scenarios that have happened in the past that were significant, and there are now recommendations based on the org chart of where we should go in the direction and the guidance as given. Is there going to be an opportunity to say, okay, here are the 5 or 6 things that we missed completely, and as a result, here is what we're putting in place to make sure we don't have those things happen again? And one being the separation, the number of separations that took place, I believe it was in September, and after our meeting, and how do we get that information? So is there 2 signatures? Is there a process that's even more, that's more in depth that we're not going through today? But for the clarity of understanding when significant issues have already happened, and we've had last 3 CEOs who have examples of what happened, can we walk ourselves down and to the point that we see where the fail point was at that point, and now we have a correcting or mitigating factor going forward?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, informally, what normally happens in most organizations, if the CEO is going to have a significant layoff, they talk with the chair of a committee, for example, if there's an operations committee or something of that ilk, and say, look, I'm going to have a layoff, either it's budget oriented or it's, people being ineffective or whatever the reason is. But it's my opinion that those processes normally, come together over time. Very seldom are they last minute. Jane was a great employee for 24 years, but she turned really bad last week. Other than dishonesty, those normally come together. And so I don't know if you want to do a policy on it or just, do it internally. But yeah, you should know that these events are coming.
I think that we just need to not assume we have a checkpoint. And I know we have recommendations here and so forth, and I think we're beyond. We have worked with facts to make sure we have a tight process, good governance, and we have the authority that is responsible for the action, and then there has been some type of discussion beyond that, where we can all collaboratively understand what's happened versus us hearing about things and then having the conversation around, well, we can't talk to the board member and so forth. So it just exacerbated this whole situation. And I would like for us to make sure as we're doing this process today, that it has, I would say, depth, where it will specifically say, here are the 5 or 6 things that were so flagrant and egregious, and here's what we're doing to care for those. Does that make sense?
It does. And again, these are things that you should not have to read about this stuff in the newspaper when it's the organization that you're running. You should know about it in advance. And that was one of my touch points, although you're right. You may want to try and put some policies and procedures together and controls. I'm a former CPA, so, once an accountant, always an accountant. Some controls in place that, allow to make sure those things happen that you're talking about.
And if I can comment on that further, what I'm hoping and what I think we're hoping from our side to come out of this with is after we've gone through our discussion points with Mr. Adams' recommendations and some of the other thought processes, that there's consensus for us to go back and do some proposed policy changes, and then also maybe on the other side of that, proposed process changes from the CEO and bring those to you, because in order to change your policies, there's a process for that, but before we actually change anything, I think we make some recommendations on actual changes and bring those back to you if there's consensus, because you can't take a vote today, even though I think you might have a quorum anyway, but, so if you have a quorum, you can take a vote, but otherwise, we just get consensus and bring back these policy changes. I foresee that there is some need for policy changes, both at the general counsel provisions, but also some of these other issues that we're talking about in terms of the org chart, in terms of if there's separation agreements or there's other kinds of separations of employment that there, especially on senior management, how that's dealt with, and at least some touch points within your policies.
Thank you very much. Mr. Adams, very good presentation. Thank you, particularly with the options of how to structure the legal going forward, as well as the HR issues that you found in your investigation. I just have a couple of comments. Particularly, I like the current structure where we have the outside general counsel, as well as the internal legal structure to handle the day-to-day issues. I found it through my 5 years here that working with Julie and David Smith, I could go to them with questions that I had regarding issues that I don't know that I could do that if everybody was in-house. It's just a level of separation. I know within Temple Terrace, the city council hires the 3 charter employees, the city manager, the city attorney, and the city clerk. So to that point, I believe, though, that the board needs advice and consent on who the legal counsel is, be it general or internal. Doesn't necessarily have to pick it, but for the general counsel, I like the RFQ process. It gives us a chance to look at the thing from 360 degrees. And I also like the dotted line additions. So whatever we have to do to make that happen, I think is important. It is interesting with the dotted line from the Director of Legal Services to Board Counsel. Hadn't thought about that, but that gives a level, a backup level that some of these issues that generated and fostered during the last 2 regimes, or the 2 previous regimes, hopefully couldn't happen again, or at least we would have an opportunity to learn more and learn the truth of what was really going on. So I'm in favor of that moving forward and getting somewhere. The HR issues, as you said, a lot of these things will be fixed when we get a good, competent HR director. Somebody who's a professional, who knows the lay of the land, or the lay of the HR world and sphere of influence, and can get some of these things implemented and instituted. To your point, to Ms. Williams, the reason people were leaving. We didn't know. We just didn't know, and there was no way to find out. So just to summarize, I like what we have as a general scheme. I do like adding the dotted line responsibilities, maintaining the separate general counsel, the board counsel, but have the internal, because you guys get bogged down with day-to-day, got to get to review this contract, that contract. Well, wait a minute, we have board issues that we need to address. I'm not an attorney, I'm an accountant, so I know what you're saying. The controls are critical. You guys know your profession better than I ever would. But no, all in all, I think it's a good report. It gives us some things to look forward to. I don't know what kind of time frame we're looking at. This meeting has taken a long time to get before us, so I hope we can move forward with something to at the very least, give Mr. Drainville some help and guidance in what he needs to run the operation. So, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, good comments, yeah. Director Johnson?
Thank you all, and thanks for all the great suggestions on here. I think that these all really give us an opportunity to be able to move forward quickly, as I think we're, trying to be able to do. I think that a lot of the kind of these organizational issues that we're looking at here, with a couple of good hires, I think are really those are going to get worked out. And I think we've got some opportunity there to be able to do that as long as we get these done in a relatively quick fashion, give Mr. Drainville the opportunity to be able to get these individuals in quickly to be able to do some of the work and, work on some of the suggestions. I'm not really married right now to any particular general counsel, director of legal services structure right now. I think one of the things, if I remember, and Mr. Adams or Julia, if you want to, correct me on this. I think that the Aviation Authority, the board and the CEO both have the ability to hire, fire, correct?
I think David Smith may know that better than I do.
Yeah, basically, they go through a procurement process which is approved by the board. So the board is absolutely instrumental in the hiring of the general counsel for the Aviation Authority.
Okay, that answers one of the questions that I had about that. And again, I'm still wanting to be able to kind of get a little bit more information about that, and I can talk to Julia or Mr. Adams offline if need be. But I think that there definitely needs to be the ability for the board to make sure that essentially have that safe space to where we can talk to our general counsel, whatever that we want to be able to call the individual, to be able to make sure that we're getting information in a timely manner and in an accurate manner to where I don't have to second guess what's actually coming to me or wonder whether or not there has been some type of pressure applied somewhere within the organization. So I hope that we can get a clear recommendation in a very timely manner. I think that with all the things that we do have, that we are trying to do right now, we do need to be able to get this done quickly. As Director Schisler mentioned, this meeting has taken a while to be able to get on the books and to be scheduled and for us to be able to start looking at something. So if we are going to do something, we need to start moving fast. And again, thank you for all the information. It's going to allow us to be able to move fast and come up with some good ideas to be able to move forward.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Director Knight, then Commissioner Kemp.
And again, thanks for the information and suggestions. I as well like to see that moving forward, even with the Operations Safety Committee, look at some of these points and try to bring something, start working on the tweak part of it. I also like to acknowledge and appreciate our interim CEO. I think about 40% of the jobs that was vacant been fixed, been hired, and sure it's going to continue on in a positive, which we all agree that it's going to help. But again, some of these things here, and even on the vote, that we put it together in our next committee meeting, we come up with some things that we can pass on to the full board to continue to move. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again for all the info.
Thank you, Director Knight. Commissioner Kemp?
Thank you. And some of the other comments have made me want to ask about, I don't know whether this is like too far down the process, but I think it was very significant. I feel as though I know the general counsel, or I like it better, board counsel, as you've named it, is responsible for the review of the CEO. And that's really significant. I also want to point out the fact, and I'm not sure how that's collected or done, but that there's like a system-wide way to evaluate. I also think what would be significant, especially with ethics point, which I have to say I had not heard of before, that, there's almost like an audit by our board council, and you kind of suggested that on a, I guess, a monthly basis almost about.
They just monitor it.
Yeah,
They get sent
okay.
out to everybody, and they can just kind of, everyone can see what's been posted on it. So
I
the
see, that
complaint
would be
comes in,
good.
when it gets posted, everybody who's been assigned to it gets to see it. And just, it's another set of eyes that allows you to have an alternative stream of information. That's my point, is I want to be able to get, like some of your fellow board members have said, let's make sure people get timely, good information so we know what's going on. You don't want to hear about it after the fact.
It almost seems too like that should be, for better or for worse, part of the, and, you know, understanding that it doesn't have to be any final decider of anything, but just for the board's information.
Right.
At the evaluation process, to have that available especially. But the other thing that happened here that I think is really critical is that the CEO, because of sunshine, we can't talk to one another. The CEO did not have it noted about the evaluation on the agenda. That wasn't there. We should have not been able to proceed without that on the agenda. However, the CEO was also responsible. What happens here is that we each get briefed. That's typical at the county, that's typical at any agency. So we had the CEO briefing us on her own review that was very unfinished, and with suggestions for a salary increase, but we did not have a briefing by our attorney, who I think should have been doing the briefing to each of us with all the information, not the CEO. And I found out after the fact that some board members were not even briefed and did not even know that that was coming before us. They were left out for whatever reasons. And I think that, I don't know if you have to write that in someplace or whatever, but I think that that was really, really, and has been really critical.
And yes, that was not the cleanest process, and it also didn't follow the typical process. So, and I think that's part and parcel of what my observations have been, is that there's an assumption that things are happening a certain way, but they're not delineated, and as a result of that, things, and I think David Smith said it very well, it got left up over time to the assumptive belief that a CEO coming in understands that they are obligated to brief their bosses. I mean, and that's just reality. The reality is that it's not written as well as maybe it could have been, but you would have assumed it wasn't going to be a problem. So, you know, now we understand that what we need to do, and what I'm going to recommend, is that some of these issues, such as reiterating the general counsel role into a board counsel and director of legal services, I was going to always make a recommendation when I got some chance to use your executive committee that you have within the bounds of your policies today. Other organizations that I deal with, they actually use their executive committee for the purposes of evaluating the CEO, along with the board counsel and the director of human resources. There's models for all of this, and I think in the past, that is in fact how it's been done, maybe not using the executive committee, but has been done that way. But we just had a series of unfortunate incidents where it wasn't necessarily processed in that same way. And I think the goal is to clarify it in your rules and in your processes, so that way, you know, notwithstanding what one CEO does or the other CEO does, everybody knows who's on first. So at the end of this, that's my recommendation, is allow the conversation, and then we can come back for some changes, and for us to, I would like us to build consensus today on a time frame. We can't take an action because it's a workshop. I was reminded of that because I forgot it was a workshop, not a meeting, but, and possibly in the September timeframe after your budget is put to bed, for us to bring back some red lines and say, here's what we're thinking. Because, you know, we can all kind of talk this through, but I kind of sense that everybody's at least not necessarily on the same page on the language yet, but you understand where I think this needs to go.
And again, I just want to thank you for the excellent presentation. And I didn't know whether to go into that far, but I do think that's a really significant point that I wanted to be thinking about as we move forward.
Yeah, good points. Director Mechanic?
Yeah, I don't want to just keep on saying the same thing over and over, but I agree with all of the policy recommendations. I do think, per Julia's suggestion, that we receive them in writing so we can look them over and vote on them, probably one at a time. And to that end, on the question of the board council and the relationship with the board, I think we should articulate exactly the appropriate communication that should occur between the board and the board council. Because I think that's been a source of breakdown in the past, and it's never been memorialized. And what David is saying is very good, but we still need to define it in some clear way.
Good points. Is there anyone else? Anybody? Is there anyone online? I just want to make sure I don't miss anybody. Is there anyone online that has any questions for Mr. Adams or Ms. Mandel? Okay, and Ms. Mandel, I guess that encompasses your, because it had on here that you were going to do a presentation, so this encompassed everything.
It does, yeah.
And I guess the one question, everyone, great comments. I think this is a real good discussion. The language that is in here for the recommendations, I just want to clarify what you're trying to strike, board general counsel. Is everything in this recommended language still correct as your recommendation? Because I see board general counsel. I just want to make sure the language is right in the recommendations. Okay.
Yeah, so my recommendation was just to change the term from general counsel to board counsel to delineate the fact that their responsibility is to the board as opposed to general counsel as organization-wide, which I think is bifurcated between the director of legal services, and general counsel, or
Yeah.
what we call general counsel today. So by making it board counsel, it's very clear that that's the counsel who advises the board, and if there's conflicts, you should go to board counsel to get those conflicts resolved.
Sure, good.
And
Yeah.
I think we will, ultimately, I think Julie is absolutely right. We should come back with specific language, red line language from what we have and what we, prepare, and I'd like to see that done. My recommendation was by year end, but I think if we start on it right after you get your budget done, which is a complicated process, that's a good thing, and we, hopefully by calendar year end, we will be able to have all these implementations in place to satisfy the concerns of the board.
Good, good. All right, anything else? Ms. Director Williams?
Thank you. I'll make this quick. The ethics point, I know we talked about that, but I just want to make sure we clarify that there'll be ethics point at each committee meeting. So if there is something that comes up from an operations and safety standpoint through ethics points, we talk about that and try to bring resolution, and then we'll bring it to the board.
Correct.
Versus it.
But board counsel would be your go-between, so they monitor it, and if there's
Okay.
something that they think that needs to be brought to the attention of either a committee structure or the full board, they would be the person who does that. Because I have to tell you, there's some ethics point complaints you get that are not meaningful, as you might imagine.
Right.
So you need somebody who's in the position of, evaluating what's worthy and what's not worthy. But there were a lot of ethics points during my investigation that came up that had that been brought up to the board, you would have gotten more timely information and might have started this whole process earlier. That's my point. So board counsel is going to be your person who looks at those and has just copied on them in my recommendation. And then when they see something that either the same thing over and over again or one thing that's of critical importance, they bubble that up either to the committee structure or to the board chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner Myers.
Councilor Adams, you bring up a very good point toward the end, because when employees were emailing the commissioners about concerns, we ignored it as a board. And we have to make sure that process will be in place going this time, because we could have cut this off early on in the process. And we felt as a board, it was just disgruntled employees, but that were not the case.
Correct. That's why you want to have
Yeah.
some methodology to help bubble those up, the ones that are meaningful, as opposed to the ones that you get that are not meaningful, so-and-so doesn't invite me to lunch, and I'm upset about that. Those are not the types of things that need to get to this level. Whereas if there's a systemic issue that does need to get to the board level, those do need to get bubbled up. And that's why I think board counsel's in a position to kind of watch those and to bubble up the ones that are appropriate.
And I see that, because candidly, until today, I had never heard of Ethics Point either, but I see that. But I know when the certain things were coming into different members, that's when we would get involved. That being said, the past is the past. I see this as a delineation of the duties of your board counsel versus the duties of your Director of Legal Services. They don't have to be super specific in a board policy, but they should be generalized, so that way everybody knows who's responsible for what. And there's no question, notwithstanding who's a member of the board, or who's the CEO, or who's the Director of Legal Services, or who's your board counsel, everybody becomes on the same page as to what the general responsibilities are. And if we document that, I think going forward, it'll alleviate some of the issues of who's on first, which I don't even know that I could say that that's anybody's fault. Some of this resides in the words we're not really saying the things that we wanted them to say.
Yeah, those are great points.
And,
Commissioner Kemp?
and just to respond, Commissioner Myers, because I don't want employees of the organization to think that, for my case, I was very concerned about all that. We were only getting it at the county commission, because that's the only emails that people had. And so we had it raised at the meetings, and you raised it, and I know, and I appreciated that you raised it. My guidance was, and I would think that there's some level of that. For one, what we're looking at here is we didn't have perhaps the tools in place or operating that we needed to deal with that, and that's why we're doing this. But secondly, the questions of that being discussed in a public forum like this, what the guidance was in terms of our employee issues and what we should do and how we should handle it. So, I outside of this meeting, I did ask quite a bit about that and tried to see what we could do. And that's kind of why I was very interested in having these things happen, so that we have some kind of pathway in the future to deal with that, because that wasn't even the first time, unfortunately, and I couldn't understand why we didn't have the mechanisms, or if we should, what we should have in place and how it should work. But I do want to make clear that I don't think that there was any board members, quite honestly, who weren't concerned about that, and I know you were, and I appreciate that. But it wasn't that it was being ignored, I don't believe, by any board member.
Very good, yeah. And, I'll just say real quick, I've been in-house, and I've also been hired by in-house. I used to think in-house counsel, all they did was hire lawyers when they went to litigation, until I actually had to do it. And it's so critical, because I think you touched on it, the cost to have me just draft a simple document or a warning letter. I think that the model that we have is cost-effective. It's just those checks and balances. I think in-house counsel and a CEO, their relationship's going to be organic. They work together every day, and it's just going to naturally become organic, to where having this model that you're suggesting, I think, makes a lot of sense. So, did anyone else have any other questions or any? Okay, great. So next are the recommendation to form today's workshop for the full Board of Directors to vote on at the August 7th, 2023 regular meeting. One is to authorize staff to proceed with solicitation for a contract for Board General Counsel services, and two, authorize the interim CEO to modify the existing contract for Board General Counsel with Gray Robinson, PA, to extend the contract and to increase the not-to-exceed amount. And are there any objections? Yes, you can.
Sorry, make a comment on that. Right now, your general counsel contracts, I think is on the, either
Okay.
expiring or in the process of expiring, and there needs to be additional money put in there. If we're gonna change our policy as to how it works, I would suggest that we hold off on doing any kind of RFP or whatever we end up doing until we've got that policy in place, because it may have a change to the process. So I wanted to make clear why that request was being made, but also
Okay.
with the consensus that I believe we're forming today.
Sure.
We're gonna kind of a little bit reconfigure what's out there, and so that needs to be kind of thought through when you're
Sure.
looking at moving forward with a new general, we don't know if it'll be a general counsel contract
Yeah,
or
that's
not.
great suggestions after today. It's okay. So are there any objections to what I stated, or Ms. Mandel, or, okay, great.
I'm sorry, can you restate it? I
Okay,
wasn't,
so to authorize staff to proceed with solicitation for a contract for board general counsel services, and two, how do you want me to articulate the second part then?
Well,
Or do you recommend?
I think that putting on the August 7th meeting, both of those items is appropriate. I just wanted to give some context to them.
Okay.
And the understanding that although that language for the RFP has changed versus what's actually in your policy today, the intent with your consensus is that they will match up.
Okay.
can I just clarify, just, because I'm a little confused with what I had. So this is, whatever you're saying is to deal with at the August meeting? It's
Correct,
just for an
yep.
agenda item?
Correct.
Okay, got it.
But I wanted to give the context of, one, why there was a request to add additional money into the existing contract. It's because it's run out.
run out,
And if, and in order for us to proceed forward with this additional time, we're gonna need that to work through. And then the second part is that you're going to need to do a new RFP or RFQ, however they're articulating it, under the new potential policy. And so as that moves forward, it'll have to take into consideration how you revise your policy.
So is this, when it comes August, and I'm fine with bringing it to August 7th, and maybe that's the time to discuss this, but so, because what I understood is under your contract now is just to extend it.
Correct.
And, yeah, okay, and not kind of a renewal or anything.
It's not a
Right, right, right,
renewal,
right,
and that's
right.
why maybe I didn't make that
Okay,
abundantly clear. I wanted to make sure
I didn't hear that
everybody
in
knew.
the language, and I was
That
confused.
extension was simply to allow us to continue to proceed forward under your existing policy with our existing contract, because that's expiring and running out.
Okay,
of money.
second.
And I may have read it a little too fast. The word extend is in there, so maybe.
Oh,
if I-
okay, second,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just
Yeah.
missed, because I
I
had
may
a
have-
certain conception of this, and
Sure.
I wasn't sure I was hearing it.
Director Knight, did you have a question?
No, I was just questioning, even though we're in the workshop part of this now,
Yeah.
and early on in that special meeting, probably could have made a recommendation. Being
Yeah.
that it didn't go through the audit and finance to go to the board. So that's
Yeah.
why.
I don't think we
Okay.
can do, we're in a workshop, so, yeah.
No, no,
Yeah.
you can't, I mean, if the desire and the consensus of the board is to take which part through the audit and finance committee, both of those items, I think there might be a time frame, and, I'm a little uncomfortable
Yeah.
speaking too much about it because, it's a contract that I
Okay.
have an interest in, but, but I want to direct you properly.
sure.
As it relates to the procurement side of it, if you want that to go through another process, you have a specific process that you do for your RFPs for legal counsel, so that will ultimately have to go through another process. But however you would like to deal with that, I think is up to y'all from a consensus perspective, while you can't take a vote on it. But can I also ask one more question? Because I would like to be able to bring back these proposed amendments, feeling consensus to proceed forward. Would you like me to have those I'm looking for consensus on this, to go to a committee before I take those to the full board? Or would you like me to take the general concept to the full board, and then we can send it through the process to committee?
What's the board's pleasure on that?
I think we need to wait to the August 7th meeting, and we give the directions at that meeting. It's just as a workshop today, and no action whatever should be taken.
Yeah.
That's all. This
That
is
makes
strictly
sense.
workshops. August 7th, we'll take all the directions that we need to take and direct you or your organization to come back, the council, with whatever proposal
That
you
makes a
suggest,
lot of sense.
okay?
Let's do
Okay.
it that way. Thank
Let's just
you.
do it that way. Okay. Good suggestion, Commissioner Myers. Okay. All right, well, I think then that wraps up the workshop for today. Anything else